Alright, well, welcome everybody, thanks for being here. And today I'm going to do my first presentation, first of three parts of the presentation of my thesis project. As you might have seen, I'm a history major, senior history major, and this is my final project. So, first of all, I was going to thank Professor Turner, but he left. Well, my supervisor for this one is Dr. Barry Gaines. I don't know if any of you know her. If you don't, I hope you get to meet her because she's a great instructor. If you have a chance to take the class with her, definitely go ahead. I don't think she's going to be here today because she's teaching a class. That's where I'm recording it so she can see my presentation. But I mean, anyways, she's my supervisor. So, well, as you can see, of course, my thesis topic is up there: the evolution of naval and land warfare in the ancient world. And the good thing about thesis projects, like you can pick anything you want. There's not a cookie-cut model. They don't tell you what to do. You just pick whatever you want. And of course, you have to follow certain guidelines. But basically, what a thesis project is you choose a topic and you have to read. Well, you pretty much have to research everything there is to know about it. I mean, of course, you're limited in time. You only have 3-4 months to do it. But you have to research as much as you can, and then at the end come up with a thesis, what's called a thesis statement, or basically your argument. And that would be a statement that you would have to back up with all the evidence you've been gathering for 3 or 4 months. So I'm in the kind of in the middle way now, and so I want to share to you what my thesis statement is, or where it is so far. I'll talk a little bit more about my the title of it in a minute. But basically, when I started doing this project, what I wanted to find is, well, the only condition my instructor set is that my topic had to involve some kind of change over time, and that's what evolution is all about. The word change it's in there to evolution. If you want to define evolution, you have to use the word change. Usually it's for the better, and sometimes it sticks around, sometimes it doesn't, but it involves change. That's the important part. So what I really want to do with this project is to be able to tell why and how is it that warfare evolved in the ancient world. And it's kind of been of a challenge because these are very ancient accounts, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 year old accounts. So it's pretty rough to find information that dates so far back. But I'm doing my best. So okay. So to start off with the title, let me explain what the title is really all about. I already said evolution of warfare. But evolution, we know we're going to talk about changes, but what is exactly warfare? Why would we study warfare? And this question is probably is the same question that most of you have asked yourself at some point in your life. Why do you study history? If not in college, maybe you did in high school or middle school. Why in the world would we study history, something that is already past? It's been years and years. We can't change it. We can't do anything about it. It's just there. Why would we bother studying history? And it's kind of the same approach to the question, why do we study warfare? And the answer is in a way there's a reason for people to think that, and in a way it's valid. You really can't do anything about the past. And what's worse, some people even say, well, none of us was there, so we can't even tell if what we know is true. None of us was there, so we really don't know. So it doesn't seem like a good thing to study history, but there's one thing that keeps bringing people back to it, and what basically keeps historians getting jobs, and that is one characteristic that history has, and which is the one that serves the purpose for society, and that's why it's still being studied. And this characteristic is, some people say that history is a cycle, it's cyclic. Other people put it as if history would repeat itself. That's kind of the things they say, but there's a certain degree of truth to that, but it really is all about one word, and it's this word, patterns. That's really where we are, why we study history, to find these patterns. You know, whether they will repeat themselves or not, it's not really a matter of study. We just want to find them, identify them, so whenever we kind of see them coming back again in our society, in our present world, we know what happened in the past, how they dealt with it, what were the consequences, you know, so we can be prepared for it. That's the most valuable thing about history, that we can learn from it. And that's pretty much the same approach to the question, why do we study warfare? The exact same reasons. Warfare has been and will always be around society, unfortunately. So the better prepared we are, the better we understand it, the better prepared we are for it, the better off we'll be. So that is really what we're looking for, and this is really the core of my research. I'm trying to find and identify the patterns why warfare has evolved in the ancient world. Well, why it did evolve in the ancient world. With the next slide. Like I was saying, warfare has been and will always be around for us. From my research, I found out that actually, we've been fighting wars forever, but usually only the last 5,000 years are officially recorded as civilization. And in those 5,000 years, only 300 of them have no officially recorded wars. So, that's roughly 300 years of peace in 5,000. And it's just saying not officially. They could have been, we just don't know about them, probably. So, that's pretty fair to say that warfare has been around forever. And it's also safe to say that it's being a motor of civilization. As bad as wars are, well, they're always, I could say that some of the best technological advancements of humankind have been through war. So, it also has its bright side to it, if the way to put it. But what else does warfare encompass? Well, warfare is also about strategy. That's one of the things that forms warfare, and this is probably the largest one, the biggest in scope for warfare. And strategy, it's basically, in other words, it would be the plan. You probably hear this all the time, that there must be a strategy, they follow a strategy, but what they really mean about that is they must have a plan. And to execute that plan, you have something else called tactics. And in warfare, they are very often used. And these things have evolved so much that now they even use this stuff in business. I have seen some of probably one of the most classic military treatises in history is The Art of War by Sun Tzu. You probably heard about that book. The Art of War is very famous. Well, now I saw a couple of years ago that some authors completely adopted Sun Tzu's ideas and brought it to business world. So now they're using pretty much military terms and military strategies and tactics in businesses. So, that's just another evolution of warfare. But that doesn't concern us because we are in the ancient world, at least for this time. Logistics, it's pretty much how warfare, how the army, how the country manages its resources, how they get it to the front lines, how they secure their lines of supply, making sure that the terrain in front of you, what's going on, it basically concerns the resources that the army needs to advance. Technology is a big one. It's probably one of the biggest ones, especially in the modern world. Back then in the ancient world, it wasn't such a great of a deal. We still talk about some of those, but this one usually concerns the modern world. Today's wars are basically fought by machines. Men operate the machines, but there's pretty much the machines who are fighting wars. Back then, it was not so much. And we'll talk about technological developments in the ancient world today. Another one is diplomacy, and this is crucial in warfare. Basically, you could even say it's one of the things that starts off wars. If you probably, I don't know if you've heard about it, but there was this military theories, the Prussian military theories from the times of Napoleon. He's probably the most famous military theories. His name is Karl von Clausewitz. He's a Persian, and he said he defined war as the continuation of diplomacy through different means. You know, that's just to give you an idea of how important diplomacy, the role play plays in warfare. Intelligence services. This is the person who has regarded, well, pretty much established the importance of this in warfare is British Field Marshal Lord Montgomery. I don't know if you probably haven't got to World War II yet in this class, but when you do, you probably learn about him. Lord Montgomery, he was one of the key elements of the Allies in World War II, and he believes that it's all about intelligence in the army. That's actually how he managed to outmaneuver and beat Erwin Rommel in North Africa at the Battle of Alamein. And finally, psychology. It's actually warfare has its own branch known as psychological warfare, and we'll probably see an example today. But it's really not. It wasn't until probably the Greeks that psychological warfare really struck warfare. But I mean, I just threw all these elements, and all of them are part of warfare. All of them have evolved, and you know, some of them to a lesser degree, but we will definitely talk about all of them at some point. Now, what do we mean by the ancient world? I'm sure you all over this one, I mean, this is a 101 class, you've probably learned all about these already. It roughly starts around 3000 BC. Probably the first civilization, which were the Sumerians, they probably started in the 26th, 27th century BC, but roughly 3000, you know, just to round it up. And you know, at the top we have all the of the early ancient world, all those civilizations: the Sumerians, Babylonians, Akkadians, the Assyrians, Egyptians. I'm sure you're all familiar with those. But then this is well, at the bottom I have the end of it. Those are the last four ones of what's considered the ancient world: Persians, Greeks, Macedonians, and Romans. And you probably, I don't know if you got there yet to that date, 476 AD. That's when the ancient world is considered by most historians to end, because that's the year in which the Western Roman Empire fell, and that's considered the beginning of the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages at least. And this map, what you see here, is what is known as the ancient world. That's all that was known back then, and that's what's been considered the ancient world. So as you can see, it's mostly Europe, Northern Africa, the Middle East, Arabia, India, and southwestern China. That's pretty much all there was to the ancient world 3,000, 2,000 years ago. So getting now that would do to define the topic that we're studying. So now let's really get into what the evolution of warfare in the ancient world is. And you probably, you know, prehistory, that's basically since the appearance of men until, you know, people say until writing appeared, civilization settled, you know, they kind of go back and forth about it. But what we're concerned about is their way of life, you know, about their warfare in prehistorical times. And if you remember, I'm sure you also talk about this in this class, you had the nomads, also known as the hunter and gatherer societies. You know, people who really didn't live in a certain place for a long period of time. They would keep moving around. You know, I have this picture just here of how it would be like just a group moving from one place to another. And the reason they moved was because they had to secure their basic needs. You know, the basic needs of food, basic needs of water, shelter. They needed to secure it. So wherever those resources were, they would go right behind them. And you know, it really, warfare at this point, it became a matter of survival. That was pretty much a drive for war at this point. You know, if they were moving to another place and they happened to find somebody else who got there first, well, they're probably going to fight them. You know, not only they want, but they need those resources. They need those food. I mean, they need the food and the water to survive. They need the shelter for the elements, to protect themselves from the elements. So, you know, they're probably going to fight. And a peculiar thing of this period is that, you know, hunter-gatherer societies, of course, they had tools. This is probably still in the Stone Age. You know, they probably had you know, maces, knives made of stone. They threw rocks, spears, bow and arrow, at least the oldest version of it, and all of those would be used to hunt. But also, this is probably the only time in which the same tools they used for hunting or for, you know, providing their needs would be used for war. You they didn't really have a production, mass production of weapons, so they used whatever they had to fight the other guys. And that's how it went down. And it was just fighting for the basic needs. But then we will see the first evolution of warfare, and that happened when civilizations became sedentary. And by this, well, what we mean? We mean they became settled, they established. And what made this possible was this right here, agriculture. Well, you learn about this as well. Once agriculture was discovered and put in practice, civilizations don't really have a need to go out there and find resources, because they can, all they have to do is settle next to a body of water, which is another pattern that you will see all over the history of humankind. Great civilizations develop close to body of waters. So agriculture, they have the water, they can grow their crops every year, they got their food, and of course they can always build shelters. So this is really, agriculture is really what allows civilizations to settle and to establish. So now they really don't have to go out there and fight for the resources, but now it evolved and it became not a matter of going and finding them, now it's a matter of protecting your own. You don't want other people to come and steal your the resources from you. So now this is at the point where we start seeing cities being fortified. Cities need to protect themselves, so they start building walls. You have, I think around 7,000 BC, you had the city of Jericho, the one from the Bible. That's a good example of a fortified city. And this is the reason. They were protecting themselves from other people from having their resources stolen. So this is where we see the first evolution of war. They really don't need to go out and fight anymore for their needs. Now they just have to protect what they have. But what happens at that point? This word at the bottom, you see demands. Now it's not a matter of needs, now it's a matter of demands. And to explain that better, probably should put this. Like I was saying, we have all these resources that civilizations need. You have food, you have land over there, the crown represents power and of course wealth over there. All of those are resources that are valued by society. And some of them are basic needs like this too, some others are things you just want. So things you don't really need them, but I guess it's just the curse of men that they are greedy and they want wealth, they want power. So what's the peculiar thing about them? All these, like it's in the middle, there are resources, but the peculiar thing about it is that they're limited. You can only have so much wealth, you can only have so much power, the same with land and food. There's only so much for you. And that eventually becomes a problem, because we will see another pattern. This is the second one that I found. Another pattern is growth. Whenever growth, basically whenever growth happened, there was an evolution in warfare. And here we can see it. This is the first problem, and actually I think that's the best picture I could find to describe it. Overpopulation. This is actually another of Lord Montgomery's theories. He says that the drive of warfare changed because of overpopulation. If you look at the resources, let's say if population starts growing larger, eventually there's less food for everybody. There's less land for everybody. The wealth has to be split among more people. The power needs to start being shared because of a larger number of people. So eventually overpopulation will lead to scarcity in resources. So what happens? Well, like I said, it's not a matter of need anymore, now it's demanding. We want more. Men are greedy. And the best example for it is this guy, which I'm sure you talked about already in this class, Sargon of Akkad. This is the guy who's considered the first great conqueror in history. And basically what he did was go out for more. Basically, so now war was not about defending the resources anymore. Now war was about conquering. We could say that this is the point where war became an empire-building enterprise. Now this guy was out for conquering more land, getting more wealth, more power. That's what it was all about, and he founded the Akkadian Empire, and conquering previous empires like the Sumerians and the Babylonians, which are all in this same region. This is the Near East, and this is modern-day Syria, part of Turkey. So this is basically what this guy do. That's the sculpture of him to the right. This was his empire. So now we see another evolution of warfare, which is very well explained by overpopulation. And to be honest with you, what I concluded about this is that at this point it might sound crazy, but war became a win-win situation. Because if you look at it, by conducting war against other people, not only could you secure more wealth, more power, more land, all those valuable resources, you get more through conquering if you are victorious, of course. But at the same time, you control overpopulation. Of course, people die in wars. So if they go out in battle and they lose a lot of men, well, that's eventually going to help the case of controlling overpopulation. So it was a win-win situation, ironically. And even though overpopulation, don't think about it in today's terms when we have 7 billion people on Earth, it was not as large back then, but it was large within their context. I think Sargon's army numbered 5,400 men. That's a pretty small army compared to what you see today. Speaking of armies, of course have undergone countless evolutions through time. The one you see up there in the right is a relief sculpture from Sumerians. That is, what you see there is an infantry formation, and that's basically how they used to fight. It was just think of the most primitive way of fighting. It was just men armed with spears, maybe some axes, bow and arrows, and just fighting each other. That was the earliest way of combat. There was really no formations to it. This is considered a formation, but it's more like a concept. It wasn't until the Greeks that it became an established formation of the army. So this was more of a concept in which it's called a phalanx. Maybe you talk about it when you study Greeks or Macedonians. And it evolved eventually. We're not going to talk about its evolution because today we'll do it in the second part. But know that that one is the way that we used to fight. Just line up a bunch of guys with spears out in front and go fight the other guys. That's pretty much how this formation worked at this point. We will see its evolution later. But I would say the most important weapon of the time was the bow and the arrow. At this point they started figuring out that archers en masse could be extremely devastating. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this. This is just a basic bow and arrow. Nothing extraordinary about it. And this is where we see the first evolution in technology. And it was a pretty big one because it ruled the battlefields probably for 2,000 to 3,000 years when they made this evolution. And like I said, this is just a regular bow and arrow, but then they created this. It might look the same, but it's not. This is the one that I just showed up is a composite bow. That's what it's called, a composite bow. And you can see the little difference over there. You see those little, those little pieces in the middle of it? Well, that's because a composite bow is made of several parts. They figured that if they put several parts of wood together, they would be way more flexible than just a single piece of wood. So, and of course, the more flexible it is, the more tense the string can be, and the more powerful you can get. And this was a huge technological improvement. It might not look like much, but it really was. It almost kind of doubled the range of the bow. It could shoot up to 300 to 400 yards with good accuracy and good hitting power. So just think of it, 3 or 4 football fields away, somebody shooting at you with deadly accuracy, and it's going to kill you because it's coming really fast. But that became really, really dominant weapon in the battlefields. Because it was so far. By the time you got to the archers, you were probably dead by a volley of arrows. So it was really changing. And eventually, this is where we see another evolution, another pattern of evolution. And this one I like to call it probably just adjusting. That's the word I came up with so far, just adjusting to it. Of course, since you have all these archers that are just decimating armies, infantry armies in the battlefield, well, you have to do something about it, so you have to adjust to it. And what they did to adjust was come up with armor. Of course, this is one of the earliest armors that you would see this is probably for the Mycenaean period, around 1200, 1300 BC. And that was their solution. You know, if they're killing us with arrows, well, let's protect ourselves. We can't get to them. Let's just wear this armor, just to protect ourselves from the arrows. And you know, that was their way of adjusting to it. This is evolution. And you know, from this point on, you would have, in the infantry bodies, you would be divided between heavy infantry and light infantry. And the difference was that one would be wearing armor, the other one wouldn't. You know, so yeah, pretty much. So this is where we start seeing evolution. There's more changes. They're just adjusting to what the circumstances are. And another example of it is this. This is actually a Sumerian painting. I think it might be a relief sculpture. I'm not sure. But the one thing I want you to look at is down here, the third line. You know, they look like carts, maybe like baggage. You know, carts, something like that. Those are the earliest forms of chariots. And chariots were the ones that dominated the battlefields in the ancient world. They were very light vehicles. And you know, in the earliest times, like the Sumerians and probably Babylonian times, they were mainly used for transport. You know, just transporting pretty much the elite warriors or royalty in the battle from one side to the other one. But eventually they evolved and they were used as war machines. And you know, every civilization used them differently. For example, the Hittites, they used them with spearmen. They would use it to do an impact charge on the infantry. Egyptians used them with javelin throwers, just to get in range and start skirmishing against them. The Assyrians used them with archers at long range with the composite bow, became very deadly. So you know, everybody would use them differently. But eventually they evolved, because at this point they were not pulled by horses yet. We're talking about 2500 BC at this point in time. They were pulled by asses, pretty much. You know, the horses were not domesticated until 2000 BC, probably. And eventually, of course, when they domesticated horses, well, the chariot evolved, and now they were using them with horses. They're faster, stronger, have better stamina. And you know, I would even though it's horses and we're talking about an animal, I would still put this under the category of a technological development. You know, because it still required them to domesticate them, to train them for this. So you know, I would put it under that category. So we're still seeing the same pattern as before. You know, and you know, these things ruled the battlefields probably for the next 2,000 years after they were used with horses. They were very deadly chariots. Now we get to this, Kadesh. Kadesh is probably, well, this is a battle that took place, of course, in 1274 BC between the Egyptians and the Hittites. You probably talked about this one in this class, maybe. And the reason why I put it up here is not to show any kind of evolution, but because this battle will be the kind of the benchmark for evolution. This will like kind of set the standards of what a battle would be. You know, there probably were others, but this is the most important one because it's actually the only battle of the early ancient world that is documented. We know about some others, but they're really not documented. We only know they happened. About this battle, we have every single detail. We have why it happened, how it developed, who fought, how many men, who won. We know everything about this battle. Even there's a documentary by the History Channel about the whole battle. So, you know, this happened in the 13th century BC. 100 years after this, the Trojan War happened. But even about the Trojan War, all we know is what Homer told us, and that's not even describing the battle itself. It just describes individual combats between the heroes. You know, it's a poem, not a history book. So basically, this battle is the one that would set the benchmark for everything. And we really, even though I'm pretty sure there were some evolutions in probably strategy, tactics, or logistics of this battle, there's no way of knowing it because we don't know anything about previous battles. So we don't have nothing to compare it with. So, you know, at this point, we're just going to use this one as the starting point to start evaluating battles in the ancient world. Over there's just like the map of the battle, at least the first stage. And you know, here we can see the use of intelligence. I mean, not there, but I mean, I'll tell you anyways. Pretty much what happened was that you see these lines. Let me point them out for you. You see these lines, this is the Egyptian army advancing towards Kadesh. They want to capture the city. And you know what the Pharaoh Ramses II did was he split his army in 4 divisions. And you know, he didn't really use an intelligence army. So what happened was that the Hittites, very cleverly, what they did was they purposely sent 2 spies to the Egyptian camp, but they purposely did it so they would be captured. The Egyptians thought they had captured spies, and you know, when they got the information out of them, these guys told them that the Hittite army was very far away up north. They were not even close, so they shouldn't really worry about it. So, you know, since the Egyptian army had no intelligence, or secret service basically working for them, well, the Pharaoh made the mistake of splitting his divisions, rushing forward with his division, and then the other one stayed behind. And what turned out was that the Hittite army was waiting right behind Kadesh, as you can see here. They were waiting for them right here, and the Egyptians had no clue about it. So, you know, eventually when they get past the river, the Hittite army spreads a trap, and they cut their divisions in 2. You know, they split the army half and half, and you know, it was pretty bloody at that point. But eventually, the Egyptians managed to turn around and fight back because the Egyptian chariots were superior to Hittite chariots. So you know, even though they lost the first part of the battle, they eventually managed to came back. And actually, this battle had no winner. It ended up in a treaty agreement between the Pharaoh Ramses II and King Muwatalli from the Hittites. So, you know, that's just one example of laying already the foundations for what would be way more complex strategies. You know, if you look at a battle of World War II, you would see like 1,000 arrows, 1,000 little, you know, descriptions and places. It gets very complex. It's just the early stages of it, and that's why we're going to use it for that. And here we come to the Iron Age. This is without a doubt the most important technological evolution of the ancient world. There is no doubt. This picture here, you can see some of the bronze. These are bronze tools, basically. After the Stone Age, of course, you have the Bronze Age and eventually the Iron Age. And these bronze items, well, you can see here some spearheads, some spear points, arrowheads, some kind of swords. They're not really that sharp. So, and they break up really quickly. So, you know, they're the best available at the time, but they're not for when iron was discovered. So eventually you will get to the Iron Age, and the iron was, this is where I have the most trouble with finding out where did iron come from. We know for a fact that it was present in 3 or 4 places or cultures that had iron, but we really don't know how did it get to the other places. The most accepted theory is that it was brought to Greece and to this part of Anatolia and the Levant by an invasion known as the Sea Peoples. You probably talked about them in this class too. The Sea Peoples were it was basically a migration, a massive migration of people from the north, and all the way down from Greece, modern-day Turkey, this Phoenician coast, all the way into Egypt. And they basically wiped out civilizations. They destroyed Greeks, they destroyed Hittites. The Egyptians actually survived, but it was so bad they could never go back to their former glory. After the invasion of the Sea Peoples, Egypt would never be what it used to be. So, and the reason why were they so successful was because they had iron. So they were fighting people with bronze weapons with iron weapons. So, you know, that's kind of an unfair disadvantage for them. So basically that's what happened, and after the Sea Peoples, everybody started using iron. You know, it was proven in battle, it was proven to be way more effective than bronze. And you can see all the things that were made with iron. You see swords that are sharper, you see future weapons you would see, we'll talk about them later, but you see arrows, even shields can be made, and some tools, of course, at the top. So pretty much iron completely revolutionized the way warfare would be carried, because now these weapons would be superior, and you know, civilizations who fall behind and are still fighting with bronze weapons, they would pretty much stand no chance against guys with iron. So this was definitely, without a doubt, the most important technological development of the ancient world, and it would be used probably for thousands of years. I mean, of course, today we have stronger metals. You have titanium. You have maybe some combinations of aluminum, which are stronger than iron. But for thousands of years, the iron would be the standard metal to build weapons. So definitely the most important development. And finally, the last thing we're going to talk about today is pretty much the culture with which the early ancient world ends. And these are the Assyrians, and they get their own category because they were by far the most important empire. At least military-wise, they were the most prominent empire of the ancient world. And here, like, remember I said earlier that the army of Sargon was roughly about 5,400 men. Well, you see, this is a pretty, again, the pattern of growth. The same one that we talked about. The Assyrian army was able to field over 100,000 men in battle. That's huge. And these were not just peasants with pitchforks killing other people. These were, I would not say it was a professional army because it wasn't yet, but it was an organized army. The reason why the Assyrian army was so superior was not only because they had the technology, a massive army, but also they have a very good group of commanders. They were organized. That is the key. They were organized, while others were just a mob of people fighting. The Assyrian army was actually very organized, and for that they needed the body of commanders. So you can see a pretty huge army they had, and so that's one of the evolutions that that warfare underwent at this point. From this point on, you will start seeing this kind of armies, particularly from Asia and the Middle East. Greek armies were not so big; they were more powerful, but definitely Persian armies you would see armies of 250,000 men, maybe. So it would just get huge from this point. And then the next evolution would be cavalry over there. And cavalry came, this is another pattern that I found. And I guess for this one the name I gave to this pattern is adaptation. No, not adaptation. That's the one we talked. It's absorption. That's the one I gave to it. Absorption. Basically, cavalry. Horses, of course, were already used in warfare. We said that by 2000 BC they put it in the chariots and they started using horses in warfare. But now it was no longer chariots. It was now cavalry, actual body of cavalry force. And this, from my research, I found that of course the first one to use it were the Assyrians, but they didn't invent it. They adapted it from, well, they absorbed it again. They absorbed it from the Scythians. Scythians are, they were peoples east to the Assyrian Empire, and they came in contact with them. They actually fought them. So pretty much, I would say we could say that the first army to use cavalry were the Scythians. The problem is that the whole army was cavalry. They had no infantry, no foot archers, no chariot force, so it was all cavalry. So it really is credited to the Assyrians to be the first one to mix cavalry with the other elements of an army, such as infantry, light or heavy, and the foot archers and the chariots. So it was a devastating force. They had all the elements of warfare into one single army, and they had a lot of numbers and good commanders. So the Assyrian army was just unstoppable at this point. And cavalry at this point, don't think of it as as in the Middle Ages with like knights charging downhill or like Lord of the Rings style. This was not how cavalry worked at this point. Cavalry was basically what you see there. It was mostly used with archers, just firing from a range. Since cavalry is very mobile, they can get on the flanks of the enemy, they can get in the rear of the enemy and just shoot at their backs. And at this point, it was so undeveloped. You see, they don't even have the seat in the saddle for the horse. They don't even have that yet. That didn't come until like the Celts or later in years. And you also see that the guy shooting, he's using both his hands to shoot, so he can't control the horse. So somebody else has to do it. If you see the guy on the right, he's holding the ropes, and he's the one who has the shield to protect both of them. So this would limit the mobility. It's not the same to be riding 2 horses at once than just ride by yourself. But eventually, it was actually the Parthians, another early civilization, civilization of the ancient world, that would come up with what's called Parthian tactics, in which they trained the archers to ride the horse with their legs without having to use a rope, so they could be free to fire with both hands, and they didn't need anybody else to ride the horse but them. So that would be another evolution that would take place in time. But so know this so far, that these army absorbed all the evolutions of the past. They had the most evolved chariot, they have the most evolved archers, they have the most evolved strategies with the body of commanders, and now they came up with their own, which is cavalry. And cavalry is extremely important. Armies still had cavalry corps even before World War I. Probably today some armies still do, but it's more like an honorable thing, like a ceremonial thing. They really don't, cavalry doesn't really fight anymore in battlefields. But even 100 years ago, you still see armies with cavalry. So it stayed for a while. So eventually what happened was another pattern. It's the same pattern, the one we talk about, which is adjusting. The Assyrian army was so powerful that there was nobody could beat them in battle. Nobody could beat the Assyrians in open battle. So of course, nobody fought the Assyrians in open battle. So what they do, the other armies, since they couldn't defeat them, they fell back to their cities. They adopted what's called a defensive strategy, in which you would only limit yourself to defend, rather than go out and fight out in the open battlefield, where they really stood no chance. So this is what happened. And the Assyrians, at this point, they had a very mighty and wealthy empire, so they adjusted too. They followed the pattern. What they did was, okay, they said, well, if they're not going to fight us in the battlefield, we'll go and fight them in their cities. And so they developed the art of siegecraft. And the Assyrians were not the first ones to perform sieges. We know of earlier sieges, but they were really the first one to implement it as a constant part of the army. In previous sieges in history, you would only see one case in which a civilization would assault a city or a fort, but it was like a one-time thing in a lot of time. The Assyrians made this like the law of the land. Siegecraft became their strength. And the authors that I use, they really go into detail about how they would do it. You see this here is a ramp. They would use rampers. They would basically get up close. They would build sand ramps or dirt ramps up to the walls, the top of the walls, and they would just assault the walls from there. And they would bring up the rams. Up here you can see some of the rams, and they would just try to ram the gates or the walls, and eventually assault them. And they even came up with their own device. It's known as the Assyrian siege tower. That's a device that the Assyrians created themselves. They came up with it just to assault their enemies. It basically works. It's you see this is tower. This is structure where you have archers at the top, which are protected by that little battlement kind of at the top, and then you have a ram down there. You can also see it here. It's not as detailed as over there, but that's basically how it worked. And it worked like that in the picture at the top right. They would have the ram put a hole through the wall or the gate, and then they would have the infantry just storm the hole, and that's how they would take the cities. And once they breached the walls, there was no going back. The army was just superior. So this is another pattern that warfare followed. The enemies adjusted and they adjusted back. They went back and forth like a chess game. That's why it is said that chess game is the ultimate strategy game. And a lot of concepts of chess games are used in warfare. So, but eventually the Assyrian Empire became so big, so powerful that its enemies just were too many. They expanded so much that they had enemies everywhere. All their borders were threatened by enemies, and they eventually couldn't hold against them. It fell in the 7th century BC, and one of the responsibles for destroying the Assyrian Empire were these guys, Persians, which were known as the Medes in the first place. But that is something that will concern the second part of it, which is classical antiquity. So that is we will talk about that in the second part. So for right now, that will be it. Thank you very much.
Do you entertain questions?
Yeah, sure.
Any questions? Better talking to him than it is to me. All right, since they have no questions, Mr. Gonzalez, I want to thank you for making this presentation. And I do invite you back for your part 2 when you finish it. Let me ask you guys something. Did what he said, what he presented, did it make sense?
Yeah.
Were you able to relate to it? All right, for those folks who don't like history, doesn't it make sense to be aware of some things when people start talking?
Yeah.
Okay. And when you were talking, you were hitting on some things that we had spoken about in the class. So I thank you for that. So that shows them that, you know, I'm not just pulling this stuff out of the air. He's here. So, okay. I don't have any questions, and you guys have your test, right? Okay, I'm going to take roll, and I'm going to let you guys out of here. Those folks from the previous class, you may go ahead and leave. I already have you recorded. And those folks who need a test and a scan from, stay after class so I can give it to you.
What's his name? Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, how do you stop there? And your card?
I got it. Thanks.
Okay.
The guy had a card too.